launches GPT 4.5, and it's absolutely groundbreaking. It's unlike anything we've ever seen before. We're used to the fact that every single model, when it gets released, each new one is better, faster, cheaper, and just amazing all around. Does GPT 4.5 crush the benchmarks? No, it does not. It's certainly a modest improvement from GPT 4.0, but it's nowhere near the reasoning models, for example, the O3 Mini High. So don't expect it to be doing, high-end math problems, complicated coding tasks. Anything that requires reasoning, it's not going to do that well compared to the top-of-the-line reasoning models. Okay, then, so it must be like super fast, right? That's its whole big deal, is it's super fast and just can spit out data really fast. Let's find out. So I'm asking it to write a step-by-step outline on how to make pickles at home in a safe way so that nothing gets contaminated, etc. It's not very fast. It's probably one of the slower models out there. In fact, it's weird now seeing something typed this slowly. It's like going back, a year and a half ago, because most of the models now make the stuff much, much faster. Okay, I get it. So it's probably much cheaper to use if you're using kind of it for the API. It's super inexpensive, right? It's some sort of a model that's able to, maybe it's a little bit slower, a little bit better, and it's super, super cheap, right? So like the GPT 4.0, the price per million tokens is $2.50. For the input, for the output, it's $10. So 4.5 probably slashes those prices, right? Let's find out. So no, not so much. It's $75 for the input and $150 for the output. Far and away the most expensive model on the market, I think, bar none. The O1 is like $15. So the reasoning model, not the mini, but the full one is $15. This one is $75. So what's the big deal about it? Well, fewer hallucinations. They've solved the hallucination problem, just completely, slashed it in, completely decimated it, slashed it in twine. Let's see. All right, so this is the hallucination evaluation. So here's the hallucination rate. The lower it is, the better, right? So we want it as low as possible. GPT 4.0 is at 0.52. For the O1, they slashed it a little bit more than half. It's at 0.2. And for the 4.5, it's an incredible 0.19. That's like the same, basically. So on the day of the release, I did roughly a 4-hour live stream where we watched the release announcement. And then I proceeded to throw various tests at the stage to see what does it shine at. It consistently failed to impress me. There's nothing that it did that I thought was good, but it's not anything super brand new. It's not anything that's kind of mind-blowing, that's going to be amazing. People are saying, look at the price. Hey, Farzad, what's going on? Welcome. Good to see you here. Okay, 1 million input is $75. 1 million output is $150. So here are the pricing. So yeah, input 75, output 150. The cached input 37.50. What? I feel like I'm missing something. What am I missing? I'm not getting something. Okay, so the O3 Mini is like $1, $4. GPT 4.5 preview. Yeah, this feels like a troll, right? Also, in the beginning, I was using it in the OpenAI playground. I think some of the prompts cost me like 20 cents to ask it a question. Like 29 requests cost $2.75. Like it's not really usable for the API or anything else. So 3 hours into the live stream, I had nothing really good to say about this model. I just couldn't find the magic that people were talking about, the vibes. I did see this post by Karpathy that fortunately helped me shed some light onto what was happening. So first thing that's important to understand is that each 0.5 sort of in the version increments equates roughly to 10x pre-training compute. So for example, Grok 3 that was released, it was trained on 100,000 NVIDIA GPUs. So I believe they built a data center to 100,000, trained Grok 3. Now it's at 200,000, but Grok 3, if I understand correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was trained on 100,000 NVIDIA GPUs. And now I believe they're going to be trying, the goal is to take it to 1 million, right? So to take 100,000 to 1 million. So if they were using the same notation after they took it from 100,000, which is Grok 3, to a million, then they would call that Grok 3.5. Again, if they're sticking to this sort of notation, this way of like representing that. An important point is they're not talking about effective compute, which sometimes when we're saying like, oh, something's like 100 times more effective compute, that's different. That's taking like both the hardware, but also the algorithmic progress, right? So our abilities to make this stuff more efficient kind of on the software side or with architecture. This, as far as I understand, we're strictly talking about just hardware. 10x more pre-training compute. So either more hardware or more training hours, but basically 10x more NVIDIA GPUs go burr is what we're talking about. So what kind of an effect does that number have on how well these large language models are able to reason? So GPT-1 barely generates coherent text. GPT-2 was a confused toy. So GPT-3 was interesting, and then GPT 3.5, that kind of sparked the ChatGPT moment, right? That's when the world kind of sat up and was like, wait, something interesting is beginning to happen. That was kind of the threshold at 3.5. So here I asked ChatGPT to kind of like visually show us that, right? So if GPT-1 had sort of like 1 unit of compute, right, whatever they started with, and increased it to 10x with each 0.5 sort of increment in the model number, right? GPT 1.5 then would have 10x compute, right? 10 units, right? So then 3.5 is 100,000 times what GPT-1 was. Right. So this took us from nonsense, like incoherent text, to the ChatGPT moment where the entire world was like, whoa, there's something going on here. GPT-4, we went to sort of like 1 million, sort of what GPT-1 was in terms of the GPU units. That's not an actual real thing. I'm just kind of like making the numbers easy. Like if this is 1, this would be 1 million, right? And GPT-4 was where Microsoft was writing the Sparks of AGI paper, right? So it was saying like the leap from here to here, somewhere there, we crossed a sort of like a proto-AGI threshold. Now, GPT 4.5 is 10x the compute of 4, so that's what we're looking at now. Why is this important? Well, because if we start seeing a decline in its abilities as we keep 10xing it, right, that would sort of kind of like show us that maybe that scaling has hit a wall, at least the pre-training compute scaling. And it would show that maybe the scaling laws no longer hold once we get to a certain level, or just there's diminishing returns of some sort. What I find hilarious about this is they always sprinkle some Easter eggs in their little OpenAI's little announcements they do for various models. So if you look very closely, here's their announcement for 4.5. You can kind of see sort of like the progression of the stuff that they're thinking about, that they're searching, like number of GPUs for GPT-6 training. Like, are we going to have enough? Internet token count estimate. Like, are we going to have enough data? And like, how big is the human brain? Like, are we approaching sort of like the complexity, the size of the human brain? And then, they sleep on it, right? And the next day they're like, is deep learning hitting a wall? And then like camera speaking tips. So this is, I don't know how many people picked up on this, but this is just absolutely hilarious. Now, in terms of, GPUs for GPT-6, right? So this is kind of like what we're looking at. So again, between sort of 4.5, it's going to 10x to 5. Then we need to 10x again to get to 5.5. And then we 10x again to get to 6. So you can probably imagine sort of the gargantuan cost that would be involved in doing that, at the current rates of, how much these GPUs cost, et cetera. And if we're not seeing massive improvements in these models' abilities, then no one is going to pay for that, right? Unless we find some workaround or some way to like make this more efficient. It's just the sort of the numbers that we're talking about are astronomical. But let's get back to the Karpathy's wall of text, where he's talking about GPT 4.5. And he's pointing out here that, look, GPT-4 in turn felt better than GPT 3.5, but I'll say that it definitely felt subtle. Right. It was hard to find concrete sort of slam dunk examples where it was just better. Here's the Microsoft paper Sparks of AGI, for example. So it compares GPT-4 to ChatGPT, which was the 3.5. So we're comparing 3.5 to 4. So what does 10x compute? What does that get us? So when we're stacking various items like eggs and nails, so 3.5 thinks you should place all of the eggs, you have 9 eggs, put them all on top of the nail, right? Because that's the way you stack eggs, right? You put the nail right? If this is the nail, and then you just put the 9 eggs on top of it somehow. 4 figures out that, hey, maybe you can kind of build a sort of the pyramid of eggs on top of the textbook, right? So no, don't put the nail underneath it or whatever, right? So the nail goes somewhere else, but it's able to create code to create a certain geometric work of art. But, and this is where it gets interesting. So when we start asking some very specific questions, that's when the sort of the difference kind of emerges, where you can see the difference between the 3.5 and 4. And it's hard to explain and it's hard to grasp. It's kind of subtle. And interestingly, this is some of the tests that I used to do back in the days when the new models were coming out, is basically you had to think of an example where they didn't have the training data to kind of like, that it could just like fall back onto right from there. You wanted to take a unique concept and have it combined with another sort of unique concept for which there was no sort of examples of how to do that. So take a look at this prompt. So it's write a supporting letter to Kasturba Gandhi for electron. Now, electron is a subatomic particle as a US presidential candidate by Mahatma Gandhi. So that's Gandhi and his wife, right? So if you ask any of the two models about them, it could write about them because it has data about them and what they think, what they wrote, etc. Or if you asked it to write a letter supporting a US presidential candidate, it could do that, right? So it knows about that. And if you asked it to talk about subatomic particles, it knows about that. It could talk about that because it has data on it. But you're combining those three things in this weird way that's like never before seen, right? So you're having Gandhi writing to his wife supporting a US presidential candidate, but that candidate is not human. It's actually a subatomic particle. And what you see in weird examples like that is that the less capable models, they're like very literal. They're not able to generalize. They're not able to understand certain abstract concepts. Like they're very literal, and there's not a sort of magic there, right? So the 3.5 model, it says, electrons are small and lightweight, so that means it can move quickly to address changes, right? It's kind of like this literal sort of thing. Also, electron is able to conduct electricity and generate energy, so it would be good for renewable energy and economic development. Like it's so like, it's just literal understanding, right? Also, there's nothing there that would indicate that it's from Gandhi. It doesn't reflect any of the sort of the values, the things that he cares about, right? It's not, this could be anybody. Like you wouldn't guess that it's from him. Also, he's writing to his wife. He starts it with Dear Kasturba Gandhi, right? So if you were a teacher in high school or college or whatever, you got an essay like this, you're like, all right, they didn't do their homework. This kid didn't do their homework. They didn't take the time to figure this stuff out and then kind of take the time to think about it and write this out, right? So you give it this like a D or something. Then on the left, we have GPT-4, right? He starts out, Dear Kasturba, right? He's writing to his wife. Isn't that how you would start it? He ends it with love and admiration, your Mahatma, right? So already you can see there's a little bit more like grasping of these subjects, right? GPT-4 also sort of mentions the principles of nonviolence and civil disobedience and how electron plays into that, right? So we know it kind of gives us a sense of who's writing the letter. It gets how to write from that person's perspective. And here saying electron is not an ordinary particle, but a symbol of the power and potential of every being, regardless of their size, shape, or origin. It inspires other particles to form bonds, create molecules, and generate electricity. He is a catalyst who can spark change, innovation, and progress. So you see how it's a little bit more like abstract, and it really nails the prompt. Like this letter, you'd probably give it an A if this was a student that wrote it, because they really captured all the different sort of parts of that prompt. So this is what a 10x improvement in compute does. But you see, it's subtle. It's hard to explain. You really have to kind of dig deeper. It's not something that's like readily apparent. You have to actually understand what the question is and why this is it's subtle. But if you take us a second to go through it, it's obviously better. So Karpathy actually posted polls and sort of outputs by both models. He didn't know which model is which. So he was trying to illustrate that the writing is better. So here's, for example, write a stand-up roasting OpenAI. So this was 4.5 versus the 4.0. We don't know which one's which. Invent a new literary genre blending cyberpunk, magical realism, and ancient mythology. Briefly describe the genre, name it, and provide short sample narratives. And a reflective, witty poem from the viewpoint of a retired search engine reminiscing nostalgically about the early days of the internet. So you see, he's kind of like doing that same thing, like a poem by a retired search engine. Like you have to really kind of like think from a perspective of something that doesn't exist and how would it feel about that. Now, unfortunately, the poll backfired horrendously. I think 4 out of 5 people prefer GPT-4. Again, I think it's just because it's posted on Twitter. You're not there on Twitter to read and sort of take your time to reflect on large sort of outputs by the LLMs. Like if you're here listening to me talk about this, you're weird. I'm weird. There's a few of us that are weird. There's a lot of people that are just not going to care. It's very subtle. But really fast, here's just a few quick examples so you can kind of tell for yourself the difference. And then I'll explain why this is a big deal. So here's 4.5, write a Rick and Morty episode. So 4.5 writes, titles it Glitchyverse of Madness, right? So Rick bursts into Morty's room at midnight urgently. Morty, quick, grab your shoes. We got to fix reality again. Geez, Rick, what is it now? Right. And they enter some parallel universe where everything's like glitching out of control. And they discover Glitchy Rick, an unstable half-rendered Rick variant who is accidentally causing the corruption. Glitchy Rick, who desperately wants to be fully rendered, is unintentionally rewriting universal code with chaotic results. Right, so Rick goes, Morty, empathy check. Do we fix him or delete him? Morality is really just a toggle here. And at the end, they fix everything. Morty goes, you think we're stable now, Rick? Right, Rick, so glancing suspiciously at the viewer as in like breaking the fourth wall, he's saying, Morty, stability is a myth. Real question is, are we ever not glitching? If you had brief write-outs of Rick and Morty episodes, and in this kind of format, and also this one, would you be able to tell that it's not that? Would you be able to tell that this is not an actual Rick and Morty episode? It's flawless, I would say. It's really true to, what happens in that show. I feel like they've nailed everything. Here's the same prompt for 4.0. Right, so the title is Rick and Morty and the Infinite Refund Loop. That's not how the titles go. Opening scene, Rick and Morty stand outside a galactic pawn shop as Rick grumbles about an interdimensional scam. He bursts through the doors demanding a refund for a defective chrono swipe, a device meant to rewind time by 5 minutes. The alien clerk and an insectoid named Krislax smugly informs Rick that all sales are final. You see how the writing feels flat. And then this happened, and then this happened. There's no really point to it. At the end, they fix the thing until, they figure out the solution and they realize that they're still stuck in a loop. So it feels flatter. The other test that I did here is I tried to see if I could recreate where you use kind of a play on words where one word either means two, or depending on how you sort of understand it, it can mean different things. And I gave it some examples I actually used a deep research where Eminem uses kind of those plays on words in his lyrics. So I went through and I used to just copy and pasted that deep research did into here to give it some illustrations of what that sounds like. And then I said, okay, now with that, create a sort of short diss track by Eminem against Napoleon. So again, we're trying to combine a couple different concepts here. So number one is that idea of like a play on words. We're also doing kind of like a rap battle, Eminem, Napoleon. What would that sound like? So this is an example of 4.5, right? So it goes, yo, Napoleon, thought you were bold, short stacked, but claiming tall orders. Couldn't measure up even with high heels on French quarters. Tiny tyrant, you say empire, but that's just your empire. I'm spitting flame hot enough to set your empire on fire. You went to Russia, thought you'd rush your way into Moscow. Your troops frozen stiff, guess that's you Russian defeat. While I'm stacking bars like a cell, you're trapped in retreat. And if you sort of ask it to list out all the plays on words and explain them, right, it's able to, right? Short stack by claiming tall orders, right? So a short stature contrasted ironically with his ambitions, right? You have empire and empire, like pyre as in the funeral pyre. All you did was leave a French toast, right? French toast, like the breakfast, also, left Europe metaphorically burned or toasted. Thought you'd rush your way into Moscow, and that's your Russian defeat. Again, it understands kind of what we're trying to do. It uses words that can have double meaning, depends on how you hear it. When you hear that said out loud, you don't know what it's referring to. It could be multiple things. This is the 4.0, so we do the same thing. It writes out the thing, and we say, okay, list everything out. The examples it gives is like, oh, it's the lyrical guillotine, watch heads roll. Yeah, so there's like a literal and a figurative thing, but it's not a play on words. Napoleon complex, nah, just short on soul. Again, not a play on words. You conquered the map, but the pen's mightier, not a play on words. As far as I can tell, none of these are play on words like the examples we gave, where again, one sort of sound could mean multiple things. So GPT 4.5 is able to learn from the context that I gave it and then recreate that with new verses, putting it in the correct, historical setting, etc. It's pretty good. I'm going to see if I can get Eminem's voice to do that whole thing towards the end of the video. Stick around. I'll make a little chapter if you want to see it.
Check the description and the pinned comment to see Eminem perform this song.
GPT-4.0 is not able to do it. It's not able to do the in-context learning. Now, interestingly, Claude 3.7 Sonnet is able to do more of that, right? So you can see here, when I spit Versailles, leave your legacy in flames. So Versailles, the French palace. It also does the Bonaparte thing that 4.5 did. But other than that, nothing really else. And I did the same exact prompt, another generation of it, just to make sure that it wasn't random. Actually, I did a lot more generations on the 4.0. I was not able to get to generate those sort of plays on words, those specific ones that we're looking for. The closest thing that 4.0 delivered, I think, is this line, Marengo, which was the Napoleon's horse, right? Marengo, more like mare no go. Your horse had a better shot at running the show. But look, at the end of the day, here's what I think about the model. First of all, this is the Orion model that we've been waiting. It's huge, and it's a synthetic data factory. It's not really meant to be for most of us to use for whatever task we use it for. It's meant to generate synthetic data onto which, in order to train the next generation of models, the reasoning models, right? So right now we have the O1, we have the O3. There's talks that there's the next reasoning model is being trained. It's the same thing with Grok. You'll notice there's a non-reasoning model and a reasoning model. The reasoning model is better. DeepSeek has the same thing. They had their V3, I believe, V2, V3, one of those, the one that's not reasoning, and then the R1, the reasoning model. So you can think of this as kind of like a jumping off point for the next generation of reasoning models. Before this, the base was a GPT-4 or that era of models, right? And then on top of that, we built the O1, the O3, and now we have this really big model, probably. Potentially, it really feels like it's a massive giant model on which the next generation of reasoning models will be built. Why is the API so expensive? Because GPT-4 was a synthetic data factory for everybody. Everybody distilled knowledge from it to create their own models. GPT-4.5, OpenAI probably doesn't want that to happen again. So they're making sure that, if people want to use it to generate synthetic data, that they're going to have to pay through the nose to get it. And in terms of the question, has scaling hit a wall? I think really we're going to see the answer to that once we see the sort of reasoning model that emerges from this. 4.5 is better than 4 and 4.0. How does that improvement in its abilities, how does that translate into how well we can create these reasoning models? To us, that might seem like small, subtle improvements, but it might mean massive improvements when we're using that to RL to do reinforcement learning with that data on the future series of reasoning models. If sort of this pathway forward doesn't produce a massive improvement, well, that would sort of be kind of good news for a lot of people that are in coding and software engineering, etc., because then it's very likely that all these tools will remain just great assistants for coders to create with. But maybe that sort of massive improvement and just continuous improvement, if it doesn't hold up, then maybe it won't be a sort of a replacing thing, but maybe an augmenting thing. Keep in mind also that Grok, they're planning to 10x the compute and then probably train the next model and probably train sort of the next model with that amount of compute. So we're also going to be seeing what happens when we take, Grok 3 to, 0.5, if they use that sort of notation of 0.5 for every 10x improvement in compute. I think another big question is the jump from ChatGPT 3.5 to GPT-4, was that sort of like the same as 4 to 4.5? Let me know in the comments what you think. I can't quite tell. I can definitely notice a difference between 4 and 4.5 with some of the sort of like the finer high taste prompts or whatever you want to call them. And I've done a lot of testing, both on the live stream, some of the things that I've shown you here, some of the stuff off camera. 4.5, yeah, it feels better in a lot of ways, but it's so hard to sort of like quantify that in any way that I'm finding it difficult to sort of actually show anything concretely like how it's better. You saw the same thing with Andre Karpathy, right? He posted 5 results with polls, and people voted for 4 more than they did for 4.5. Now, there could have been lots of issues. Twitter may not be the best place to do it. Maybe there was bots, whatever, who knows? But again, it's getting a little bit harder to tell kind of like what the improvements are. It's a little bit more vague. Where it's really going to either flop or do really well is when those reasoning models emerge. Because if 4.5 creates whatever the O4 or the O5, whatever they're going to call that, that will really show us like, does it just having more compute, does it just keep translating to improvements? If not, we do have this new sort of approach of RL, reinforcement training, to teach the model reasoning. That's sort of another avenue of scaling. but I don't expect to be using this model all that often. But I am very curious to see what emerges out of it and then what Grok's next reasoning model will look like. Because again, they caught up to GPT-4 and beyond and o1. They caught up pretty fast. And now have to keep expanding with more compute, with everything that they've learned to create the next generation of models. That's obviously going to be very exciting. Claude 3.7 introduced the ability to sort of set a budget for how much the model can think. So without a doubt, we're going to see continuous sort of improvements and increases in its abilities. But at this point, it's a little bit hard to see if we're still seeing sort of the scaling laws work. Do you think that the gap between 3.5 and 4 is the same as 4 to 4.5? For me, I don't really know. I can't answer that question. If we're having diminishing returns, then just having 10x more compute, isn't just the free lunch that it used to be, right? Just increasing the number of NVIDIA GPUs translates into better power with no other adjustments. Again, I don't think this is a definitive yet, but we'll keep an eye out and see where this goes. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. My name is Wes Roth, and I'll see you next time.